Save and update in forms. It's very important to take into account all the different actions that are going to be triggered in a form. So we have to evaluate the use of each one of these actions. It is a must to have very clear at each point when we need to apply any of these actions. For example, an update action when we enter the form. Is it really important? Do we need to update the form when we enter the form? Because obviously this is going to affect the performance when we open the form. Maybe we can decide whether we want to update or save when executing a system task. This is an option we already saw previously that we can mark each time we trigger a system task. So this also affects performance. Let's imagine I create a button and it triggers 25 different uploads. If in each one of these uploads I save and I update, that's 25 saves and 25 updates. Obviously, I only need probably one save at the beginning and one update at the end. It's very important to take this into account because the button might take maybe 5 seconds to perform all those different actions when it could take much less. For example, an update action that affects the performance based on the amount of data that has to be updated. An update calculations when we're entering edit mode, for example. This is also going to affect the performance. As it says here, it affects the performance if any of the calculated fields changes its value. Lots of times we want to have a result of several calculated fields, but we don't want to update each time someone's inputting information because maybe this information is not even going to be seen in that form. Or for example, updating data when we're entering a group of fields. Each time that we open the group of fields, do we want the system to update the data that's inside of it? So it's extremely important to always take into account that all of these actions are going to be using resources of the system and they're going to affect the performance. In this example, maybe it's a very exaggerated example, it takes 28 seconds for everything to load. Obviously, it's only maybe 2 seconds to open the form. Later on, it's 5 seconds when clicking on a button, and so on. But it's very annoying for a user to have to be waiting so much time. So why would we make the system trigger all kinds of different actions that it doesn't really need to trigger? So we always have to take this into account. Here we have an example of some very important features when we're working on a form. These features, as I've already mentioned, they're going to require some resources from the system. So if we need to update the suffixes from the record to the panel, we know that this is going to require some resources. When should we mark it? Only when it's necessary. The same thing happens when we update themes. We're only going to mark this option when we actually want to update the themes in that form. If we can update them outside of the form, this is something we're going to learn later on. It's much better to do this outside of the form. And the same thing happens when we want to update rules or update calculations. Here we can see an example of a system task. We've already seen this before, but every time we're going to trigger a system task, we have to take into account if we really want to save the form before triggering the system task and update the form after doing it. Obviously, in some scenarios, this is necessary and we are going to have to mark them. But in all those scenarios where this isn't necessary, we shouldn't mark them. Here we have another example. Here we have an action button, and maybe we have 4 or 5 different actions, and maybe one of the actions we've added is update form. This option is very useful. Sometimes we want someone to be able to click on a button and update the themes, the suffixes, rules, calculations, and so on. But if it's not necessary, it's better to just mark the exact option that we need, not all of them. The same thing happens when we enter a group of fields. This is the configuration of a group of fields in a form. So in some scenarios, we are going to need to mark these options. And it's very important that we take into account that these options exist because at some point we might be maybe uploading information or we might be working with a group of fields and we're wondering why isn't this working? Why is it not showing the results in the form? Well, maybe because we need to update the group of fields. So maybe we need to mark one of these options. So every time that we're building a form, we have to take into account these updates, these saves, and so on to ensure that everything is working correctly. Here, for example, we have a library field. So when we add a library field to a form, we could say, do we want to evaluate conditions and update the viewer when we exit the library field? This is also important because maybe I'm in a form where it's asking me to attach a document, and maybe there's a submit button that does not appear unless a document has been attached. So if we don't mark this option, the form is not going to evaluate the conditions after we update the document. So it's important to mark it. But only when it's really necessary, only in those scenarios where we actually need to mark this option. Here we have another example. We have actions for an action button, and we already mentioned that we have an action that's called update. There's also an action called save. In some scenarios, we're going to need to use this action. We need to save the information before we trigger something else. Maybe it's not a system task, maybe it's a connector or something different. So obviously this feature is very useful, but we must only use it when it's really necessary. Here we can see buttons could also be triggered automatically. For example, I could say, well, as soon as an approver is filled in this field, I want this button down here to be triggered automatically. No one has to click on it. It's going to be triggered automatically. For example, let's imagine I fill in 3 or 4 fields, and when I fill them all in, I want a button to be triggered automatically and create new lines in a group of fields with the information I just filled in. That could be done automatically with this option here. This option is available in all the buttons. So when we create a button, we can say, well, I want this button to be triggered automatically based on the input in whatever field. But obviously this also requires some resources of the system and it might affect the performance. So we also have to take this into account when triggering buttons automatically. Here we have a couple examples. For example, here, when we input a price, we said it was very important to be able to save this information and then execute this operation. And once the operation has been triggered, we want the entire form to update. This way we can see the result here. And we already saw at the beginning of this session that this didn't work initially because I didn't have a save action here in this button. So when I click on it, okay, this had to be something like this. So when I click on it, we can see I'm seeing the results immediately. But then here I have a different scenario, like the supervisor instructions. The information that we're going to input here is already saved in a business rule. So I don't need to save. All I have to do is I click here, it uploads the business rule to the panel, and I update the form. Why do I have to update the form? Because if not, I would not see the results. So when we go to the configuration, we can see that this one here is only going to work if I mark both options. But this one here is going to work perfectly, even though I didn't save before bringing the business rule. So in each scenario, we have to make sure we have only marked the options that have to be marked. At this point, we recommend you to finish the exercise that you started previously, so you guys can stop the video and continue with the exercise. Thank you for your attention.